Florence?
Yeah, yeah. This is our flat.
Oh, okay, nice.
So I have opened the webinar, and you may see in your screen that people are arriving now, and they are arriving at a spectator, as it is said in French audience. So welcome everybody, welcome to this webinar on the book Growth and Welfare in Advanced Capitalist Economies. Thanks for joining us. So numerous. So we'll wait a little bit for people to be able to join us before really starting. But it's a great pleasure for Anke and myself to welcome this great panel made of various scholars from CIVICA. You may have heard about CIVICA. It's a European University of Social Science, the only European University of Social Science, which is gathering, amongst other, the Hertie School, from which Anke Hassel is coming, the London School of Economics, from which Waltraud Schelke is, the European University Institutes, from which Anton Hemerijck is coming, Bela and Greskovits from the Center for European University, Central European University, and Alexander here, and from Bocconi University, Alexander Kentikelenis, sorry, I'm not used to saying, and myself, Bruno Palier from Sciences Po, and all these universities belong to this network, European University of Social Science. And we are very pleased to organize this CIVICA event around the book that Anke and I have been co-editing, and that came out in January this year. And I still let people enter the room. The way we will be organized today is that Anke and myself will start with presenting the main insights from our chapters in the book, actually. And then we will give the floor to our prestigious discussants, going in that order: Waltraud, Alexander, Anton, and Bela. Then we will have time to address some of the questions coming from the audience. And then we'll have a last round around the table. For the audience, as you see, you can either make comments in the chat, or you can use the Q&R to ask questions, and we will try to address both this stream of interaction. I guess that most of you are now used to Zoom webinar, so you know how to use this distanced way of interacting. Don't hesitate to make comments, not only to ask questions. I've always found the chat very useful to receive some long comments, some reference to other paper, videos, whatever. This is a kind of a way of augmenting our interaction. Even if it's dehumanized, it's augmented thanks to these things. Okay, so perhaps we should start. What do you think, Anke?
Yes, go ahead.
Okay. You want to say a few welcoming words before we start?
Okay, let me welcome everyone to this session. I think Bruno and myself, we are very pleased and to some extent also proud that we actually pulled this book off together. It has taken us a long time to finish this book, more than 6 years, but now it's out, and we are very pleased that so many people are interested in, and we're very pleased that we have a fabulous panel that will discuss the book. But first, Bruno will start introducing it, and I will take over, and then we have our discussions.
Okay, so I see that still some people are coming, but let us start with no further ado if we want to have the possibility to have the discussion, which is why we are here. It would be best. Okay, so this is a book panel about this book, Growth and Welfare in Advanced Capitalist Economies. The sub-question, which is part of our research question, is how growth regimes have evolved. I'm Bruno Palier from Sciences Po, de Centre d'études européennes, laboratoire interdisciplinaire d'évaluation des politiques publiques, but also member of the CIVICA University, and you see here the logo, and Anke is from the Hertie. She will jump in the presentation. So this project, this six years long project, is not finished because, as you see, what is now published is the left-hand side of this table. But they are still running a subsequent part of the project with country case studies with, as you see, various colleagues from all around the world, the US, South Korea, Robert Boyer, who will be speaking about China, and Russia, and various European countries, to try to illustrate our approach with empirical case studies. Okay, just for introducing the audience to the book, we have divided this first book into three parts. The first one is about the evolution of growth regimes and growth strategies, and we present in a long first chapter our approach and the main findings in terms of growth regimes, and we will focus on that in the first part of our presentation. But we also have a chapter by Peter Hall, who develops his vision of the development of capitalist democracies into three phases. Let's say the industrialist for this phase, and then the financialized phase, and more recently the phase of knowledge intensive economies. And he shows that politics and the way producers demand things evolve through these three phases. Then we have Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontusson, who present their now famous approach in terms of growth models, export-led and domestic demand-led growth. We'll come back a little bit on that, but they check whether after the Great Recession, they still find their situation. And indeed, they confirmed that things went differently in Germany, Sweden, UK, and Italy. Then we have Georg Picot, who shows that beyond these four countries, we can indeed distinguish between a kind of export-oriented and domestic demand-oriented growth strategy within more than 20 OECD countries using a fuzzy set approach. Then Fritz Sharp shows that within the EU, there has been a kind of struggle between the export-led and domestic demand-led, and more or less the export-led approach has won over, at least within the EMU area. Then we have a second part, which is more focusing on actors and what they demand in terms of growth strategies and the implication it has for various aspects of the welfare state, especially redistribution, education, etc. Cassie Selen shows that some countries do a lot to remain the same, like Germany, but Sweden has diversified their capitalist model, and the Netherlands has shifted from manufacturing to a more dynamic service one. That's basically, and she shows a lot of the role actors played in that. Cassie Joe Martin emphasized the role of employers and how their demands are different depending on the growth regimes you are in, therefore pushing for different growth strategies. And finally, you have Andren showing the importance of high skill, ICT type of skill in the modern economies. Then we have a third part, which is really focusing on the interaction between what we call growth strategies that I will come back on, and Anke in a few seconds, and welfare state reforms, focusing on wages. Alison Johnston shows that indeed wage moderation boosts growth in export-led economies, but much less so in domestic demand-led ones. Alexander Reisenblicher distinguished between different types of housing markets and housing policies, again between the US and Germany, showing how much financialization through the housing market plays a big role in the US, whereas it doesn't play so much a big role in Germany, where on the contrary, low cost of housing is important. Tom Chevalier distinguishes also different configuration of education and welfare state towards young people as connected to the various types of growth strategies that we distinguish. And we develop the connections between growth strategies and welfare state reforms with Sonia Vlias in the long last chapter of this book to try to illustrate through various country cases, how they are connected indeed. So that's what is in the book, but today we are presenting the core messages of the project. And first, the idea is that we start from the fact that there is little convergence of welfare systems despite what sometimes is called neoliberalism or 3 decades of liberalization. And to understand the trajectories of the welfare state, we need to understand the trajectory of growth regimes. That's the main core point of this book and project. So we want to connect the literature on the welfare state and the literature on capitalism, varieties of capitalism, growth regimes, etc. The third point is that we want to claim that growth regimes evolve because of government action. So it's not functionalist, it's, there are action, decision, conflicts over this decision. But governments are guided, and actors also, economic actors are guided by what we call specific growth strategies. And we'll come back on what we mean by that. The fourth point is that a lot of the content of what we call growth strategies are made of welfare state reforms in the broad sense, which means educational reform, labor market reform, social insurances, social investments, etc. Finally, if we have time, we will show what we think about the politics of growth strategies and the interaction between producers groups and electoral concerns or electoral action and political parties. This is the outline of the presentation with Anke. I'll show some puzzle, speak about the growth regimes in the welfare state. Anke will speak about the old and new engines for growth, the growth strategies, and if time's allow, I will say one word about the politics of growth strategies. Okay, what are the puzzles? The puzzle, for instance, is that if you look at the balance between public and private pensions in many OECD countries, what you see is that some are increasing their public spending on pension, like Italy, Greece, France, Austria, Germany. Some are having much less public spending on pension and less increase in them because they also have some increase in private pension. And we are not surprised to see United Kingdom, the United States, New Zealand having some or a lot of expenditure in private pension, but we may be more surprised to have Denmark, for instance, having a lot of private spending in pension, but also a little increase in Sweden, for instance. So at least there is a diversity here. It's not an outright, outrageous liberalization, privatization of pension. Now we use here a graph which is familiar to Anton because it was Anton's graph. And even though Anton convinced us that there is a big push towards social investments, you see here that the share of services, the capacity to be equitable and push for a high employment rate, and in a few words, the type of social investment, if any, is very different. You don't have the same type content of social investment throughout the various countries. So here is the recurring question, how to explain the differences in welfare state transformation. And the idea here is that we need to look at the economic strategies and not only at electoral politics. That would be the usual answer provided by Celia Ozerman and co-authors in their recent book, or path dependence, which is the usual answer provided by welfare state scholars. So this is why we claim that we need to connect the literature and our knowledge on growth regimes and the literature and our knowledge on the welfare state. The problem is that the literature on the welfare state is not very well equipped to think of the connections between the welfare state and the economy and economic models, because basically what we believe when we work on the welfare state is that the welfare state has been built against the economy, the markets, etc. As you know, this Politics Against Market is the title of the first book by Fdi Led, and the key words in the literature on the welfare state is decommodification, so escape from the market, retrenchment, austerity cuts, so the bad things that the economy is doing to the welfare state, neoliberalism, privatization. So there is this basic idea that if any connection between the two, it would be an antagonistic relationship. However, if we look at history, we know from Swenson, Isabella Mares, and many others that the first social insurances have also been implemented with the favor and the action of employers. They found their own macroeconomic interest, if you wish, in building social insurances. Then almost everybody would agree that after, starting in the 30s of the 20th century and after World War II, there has been what is called the Keynesian welfare state, to use Bob Jessop's terminology, was it was obvious that the development of the welfare state and social protection, social distribution, cash transfers was good for economic growth and for especially domestic consumption. So there was a happy connection. What brought the questioning of the question is the literature on social investment, to which Anton and myself and many others have contributed, where there is a new attempt at connecting the two worlds. But what we believe is that instead of being kept in some period of time, we should have a theoretical approach that helps us to understand the connections between, let's say, the organized economy and welfare regimes. And here we refer to the literature that makes this kind of connection, which is, first of all, the French regulationists, les régulos, as we say in French, and then, of course, varieties of capitalism. But behind that, you have all these comparative political economists like Wolfgang Streeck and others who have, Colin Crouch and many others who have made these connections. Moreover, what we claim is that if we understand the way growth regimes change and evolve, we are very likely to understand welfare state transformations. So it shouldn't be only static connecting to typological literature, but also be dynamic in understanding the transformation. That's our approach. What do we say about growth regimes? We say growth regime, this is very trivial, is a mode of governance of the economy. And what we add up from the literature is that we need to understand a specific growth regime. We need to integrate what is the engine of growth in a specific configuration, a specific country, what does contribute to wealth creation, job creation, productivity gains. Is it agriculture, manufacturing, services, high, low added value services, finance, knowledge-based activities, ICT, etc. It will have huge differences in the producer's position in the organization of the economy, but also the economic need with regard to skill, education, labor market regulation, and welfare states. The second thing, the second insights we take from the regulationists especially, but also varieties of capitalism, is that if a growth regime is organization of the economy, we need to look at the institutions organizing the economy. And we here take the approach by Bruno and his 203 book, where he says that there are 5 institutions organizing the economy: the mode of financing of the economy, the product market regulation, the industrial relation, the labor market rules and organization, 4th, the skill formation system, and 5, the social policies, social insurance, assistance, and investment. But we need to add to that the most recent contribution, the coming back of the demand, if you wish, that Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontusson have put forward. And as you say, they claim that what also drives the economy is the aggregate demand, is it private consumption of the household and firms, private investment, public spending, net export. What drives demand is also key to understand growth regimes and their evolutions. And they speak in that case of growth models. So we are using these 5 institutions as key to understand the way growth regimes differ, evolve, but also shape, and this is a point we make, shape both the demand and the supply side. We think that it's a bit hopeless to try to see whether it's more the demand and more the supply. Actually, if you look at these core institutions organizing the economy, they have an impact on the supply side. You know, product market regulation decide who has access to the market and under which condition. Financial systems decides also on access to capital and the way it can circulate in an economy from one to the other one. Wage setting and social protection are key to understand one element that weight on supply side, the labor cost, but there are other things, of course. Education and training is key for the type of skill which is provided under the labor market. But On the demand side, of course, product market regulation determines relative price and consumption capacities. Financial system is key to understand the debt-driven demand, the privatized Keynesianism, as would Colin Crouch call it, wage setting allows or not a wage-driven demand. Social protection plays or not a role of automatic stabilizer, and education and training shapes partly consumers' behavior. So no need to fight, we have to be, on the contrary, encompassing in our approach. The next step is to show that amongst these 5 institutions, 3 belongs to the realm of the welfare state. And that's a message to comparative political economy, which is neglecting too often and too far the role played by the labor market, changes and regulation, social protection, education and training. And even more, we argue that with globalization, European integration, financial system is more and more globalized and escape from the reach of government. Same thing for product market regulation, at least in the European area, where a lot of this is subjected to the competition law. This means that national governments mostly have these 3 tools, plus the fiscal ones, to play on both supply and demand sides, therefore to try to have an influence on the economy, on growth, on job creation. So this is our argument. The role of welfare systems in growth regimes lead us to look at what governments are doing in terms of labor market regulation, social protection reforms, education and training transformation, in order to boost both growth and employment formation. And as we know, wages, minimum wage, social insurances, social investment are key tools for governments to try to have an impact on growth. Now I turn to Anke, who will develop the next point of this presentation.
Okay, thank you very much, Bruno. And I will start here. And I'm a bit worried about time because we already talked for about 15 minutes. You already talked about 15 minutes, so I will not talk about 15 minutes, but try to keep it rather short. So this is Bruno presented the foundations of our argument, but we also have a dynamic concept in mind, and we want to see how it's about the evolution of growth regimes. So we want to look at old and new engines of growth, and our starting point of that is obviously the starting point of industrialized capitalism, which is the Fordist period. And we argue that already in the Fordist period, even though Baccaro and Ponteson said, Fordism was basically demand-led, but even then we could already distinguish between countries which were more demand-led than others and which embraced the Keynesian welfare state, which embraced also wage inflation and welfare spending to a large extent. And these are, on the one hand, countries like the US and the UK, the liberal market economies, but also we see that in Southern Europe and in France that we have strongly demand-led countries. But on the other hand, even in those times, we already have export-focused growth. And this is based on this industrialized specialization. And there we find those countries which are usually the CME type countries. We have the Nordic countries like Sweden, but we also have Germany, which already in the 1960s specialized in an export-led economic model. So we start with the diversity of Fordism, and we see, when we look at these different types of countries, that we see that countries specialize either in export-led growth, and here we have a graph which shows the current account balance and the change in domestic demand, and we see down here those countries which are the export-led countries which have high current account surpluses, and here on this side we have those countries which have a current account deficit, and at the same time which have higher change rates in domestic demand. And we see that there's a trade-off. So countries tend to specialize in one or the other. They either have domestic demand-driven growth or they have export-led growth. But in this, we also find new drivers of growth. And the new engines of growth we define as, and that partly related to the process of financialization and partly related to the digital transformation. And as we will also show in the book, is to say financialization is actually related to the digital transformation, that those countries that embrace financialization in a big way are also those countries that drive the digital transformation, and there are reasons for that. And we try to measure that, and we give some measures for financialization. So what we look at in the book is either the savings rate, where we say low saving rate give us an indication for high financialization, so people don't save. This is also contributing to domestic demand. We look at house price inflation, and we look at the role of pension funds on the one hand. When we look at the digital transformation, we identify investment in ICT and jobs in ICT as those indicators that show us how much countries embrace in the digital transformation. And both of these aspects show us how countries embrace the knowledge economy or the digital economy of the modern age. So how do they interact? Financialization creates a wealth effect. The wealth effect is based on house price inflation. So if you have more house price inflation, you feed the financial services industries that have more volume in order to be active on financial markets, but also you feed the supply side because they create new financial products. And with these new financial products are ICT based, and with these ICT based financial products, you get more and more investment funds investing in these products. So you have an interactive effect between ICT on the one hand and financialization on the other hand, and that sets countries on a different path of economic development. And ICT is a technology that disrupts business models and creates new forms of value creation. And the best example for that is obviously the tech industry in the US. So we look at these indicators and we try to categorize countries, and we try to place countries in different groups depending on their degrees of financialization, but also depending on their focus on export-led growth or demand-led growth. And we identify at least 4 groups where we say some countries are highly financialized and have a negative trade balance, and these are the LME countries. They have very low savings rates of less than 5%. They have very high house price inflation. All liberal market economies have high house price inflation. And in these countries, we have privatized pension policies, so we have a strong role of pension funds. Then on the other hand, we have countries that are somewhat financialized, but still have export-led growth. And these are countries that also see some house price inflation. They also embrace pension funds in a positive way. They have low savings rates, but they also have export-led growth. And these are the Nordic countries. And in particular, this is the Netherlands. So this is a different group of countries we can identify. And then we have a set of countries that are not financialized at all. They have low rates of financialization, but they're also not very strong on exports, and they show a mixed pattern. Often they have a mixture of coverage of pension funds. Some have higher, some have lower, but they also have low savings rates. They have some house price inflation. And these countries are basically the countries of Southern and Eastern Europe. And the least financialized countries at all are those countries that are heavily focused on export-led growth, and they have very high savings rates. They have literally no house price inflation at all. If you look at the example of Germany, you have negative house price inflation for a very long time until very recently, and they have a positive current account. And here we have the German-speaking countries, but also Japan, South Korea, Switzerland, to some extent France, and also Belgium. So we can group these countries in very different patterns of growth regimes, and we do that. And I skip over different degrees of digitalization. This is just data you find in our book. This is just one illustration of how financialization is related to ICT, and here we use the data on ICT jobs, and you see that there's a positive correlation. So in those countries where pensions funds financialization, here we measure as the share of pensions fund assets as share of GDP, and these are positive related to the ICT employment as a share of total employment. But what I want to show you is that we come out with these 5 different growth regimes. So if we start with these 4 different groups of countries, but really when we look at growth regimes and what is the driver of growth and how do countries try to pursue these growths, we have 5 different growth regimes. And the strong exporting countries, I already said, these are the German-speaking countries where you have very low domestic demand, you have very strong on exports. exports, and this is Germany, Belgium, Switzerland, Denmark. We have then the more balanced countries where you have high domestic demand, you have strong exports, and there you have the Nordic countries, but also Luxembourg and the Netherlands. You have countries that are export focused, but they are weakly developed and they also have high domestic demand. They're export focused by trying to be attractive for investment, but they have negative current accounts, so they don't have a trade surplus. And these are the countries of Eastern Europe. Then we turn to the more financialized countries, and these are the countries where you have private demand going strong, but you are weak on exports, you have a negative trade balance, and these are the Anglo-Saxon countries. And our final group of growth regimes are those that are based on public demand. You have strong public demand, you have weak exports, and there we have the cases of Southern Europe. So how are they related to growth strategies? What is a growth strategy? And how do governments try to pursue growth in these different growth regimes? So what is a growth strategy? We do not think that a growth strategy is necessarily a government white paper or green paper where the government sets out a number of strategic goals in order to pursue growth. But what we mean by growth strategy is that this is a relatively coherent series of decisions and reforms that can be taken by a number of governments, but they also can be taken by producer groups, so private regulation as well, economic actors, business actors, but also trade unions, in order to boost growth. And it is based on an underlying understanding of the growth regime in which this country is in. These are our growth strategies and how we connect them to the welfare state and welfare state reforms is to say, in those countries where you have an export, which are export-led, and these are exports of high quality manufacturing products, the issue for the government, but also the issue of the business community, is really a control of labor cost in order to remain competitive and in order to be able to sell good products on world markets. And what we see as a consequence in terms of a growth strategy that affects the welfare state is a process of dualization, because you need the core workers who work in manufacturing companies, you need them to be productive, but you do not really need to provide universal social services and universal welfare. So you start distinguishing between those workers who are productive and who are important for your production regime, and those workers who are not very productive and who are not essential for your production regime, and you start to treat them differently. And that is what we describe with the process of dualization. And you know that there is a long literature on the process of dualization in some continental European countries. When we have a case of the export of dynamic services, and these are the Nordic countries, there you are in a different dynamic in terms of economic development. And what you need is a flexible but also a well-protected workforce. You also want a highly trained workforce because you're engaging in ICT-led growth and in a much more financialized setting. And the equivalent social policy reform strategy is to have social investment. So you invest heavily in your entire workforce, and you also invest heavily into much more universal social services. So there is a equivalent from being in a growth regime where you rely on the export of dynamic services and a social policy orientation that is much more focused on social investment. The third category and the third group of countries are the countries which are based on FDI led growth. So they try to attract investments through FDI. What they need to do and what they are concerned with is the control of labor costs, but also of social compensation. And the social policy consequent and the social policy strategy is you try to be attractive. You focus on social and fiscal attractiveness in order to boost your growth regime. So these are the three export-led growth strategies. We also found two demand-led growth strategies, which are again situated in different growth regimes. We have one, the growth regime of financialization. Again, these are the English-speaking countries, the liberal market economies, which are heavily based on privatized welfare because they use the welfare state also as a tool in financial services. and they try to boost financial services by using also the funds of the welfare state and by social protection investment by private citizens. And what you get as a social policy orientation and strategy is a form of asset-based welfare. So you want to enable citizens to buy their own homes and to use their own homes as a collateral for borrowing money, for spending money, and for therefore having a demand-led growth strategy. And the fifth one, the empirical case of demand-led growth strategy, is a strategy which is based in public domestic demand. So here's the government who tries to boost growth by engaging in heavy spending, and heavy spending can also mean a high minimum wage, but also high social spending, high spending on pensions, for instance. And this, as a strategy, you can call social protectionism, because you protect your society and your citizens by high levels of social spending. We know that at least from the financial crisis, from the moment that the financial crisis hit, that the public domestic demand strategy is not really a viable strategy anymore. And these countries run into problems, and they have shifted their strategy. And that is another one of our findings, that the domestic demand strategy is not sustainable. So they shifted their strategy into something we call competitive impoverishment, because they try to become competitive. So they try to shift their growth regime towards a much more export-led growth regimes, and they have to cut social spending, they have to cut social costs. And that is the process of impoverishment, which we describe in the book. So now hand over to Bruno, but I think we have to be very fast on this very last point.
Indeed. If you unshare your screen.
Yes.
And I just like to show one slide to say that in order to put some political dynamics here, what we think is that governments are key in what happens, and a lot of debates, and you know that there is a debate between those who would focus on the producers' demand for changes or for preservation, and those who would say no, voters decide and political parties matter. And what we think is that government is a little bit forgotten, but it's government who takes some decisions about welfare reforms, educational reforms, labor market reforms. And what we think is that a lot happens in terms of policy feedback. So in a specific situation, you may have producers pushing on governments to try to preserve their interest, therefore the existing growth regime. And this is really what Cassie Selen shows, or Cassie Joel Martin. But in order to preserve the system, government have to act upon the system. For instance, to implement the Hartz IV reform in Germany, and this may have some consequences, social consequences, which now lead to some political feedback, where you have some protests, some opposition to the decisions taken, that puts again some new demands on government, such as, for instance, implementing a minimum wage in Germany, which will probably change the whole growth regime in forthcoming years. But this is, of course, time to stop there, to open the debate. This is just a little insight on our views on the politics of growth strategies. But I think it's time to stop here. And I immediately give the floor to our four colleagues who, as you can guess, each of them have some specific comments to make viewed from their own angle. And I suggest that Waltraud starts.
Thank you very much. Try to, yeah, here we are. Thank you for inviting me. I am invited as a critic of these regime classifications and so on, but actually I do want to talk more about what I found interesting, what I find new venues for this research program, and perhaps also then speaking to people like me who are not per se interested of putting all countries in a particular regime and so on and so forth. But, you know, I respect that so many of the best scholars, you have seen the wonderful lineup, do this. And so I respect that this gives something to some scholars. And I want to talk about what the rest of us can get from this. So What I think this book adds to research on the comparative political economy of capitalism, this is how I read this, it brings together the two dominant regime classifications, the one, the Worlds of Welfare Capitalism by Esping Anderson, and the Varieties of Capitalism by Peter Hall and David Soskis, with the new boys on the block, the Baccaro and Pontusson. They have a famous predecessor, which was an equally accomplished book by Bernard Ebbinghaus and Philip Mano 20 years ago. And if I remember correctly, when I read this book, that was much more starting from Esping Anderson and looking then of what the varieties of capitalism can add to this. This time, I would say it's a bit the other way around. You really ask for this dynamic version of regimes of capitalism. They add new phenomena. There is constantly a bit this discussion about financialization, although I thought in the presentation just now, it was a bit stronger than I remember it reading your book. It's sometimes just as an aside that this is a kind of industrial strategy as well. The full range of what the financialization literature does is not in here. Perhaps that's a place for your country studies in the next book. There is a lot about the knowledge economy because, of course, quite a few of these scholars that are in the book have already talked about it. And I don't want to go too much at all into this, actually, because I have nothing really substantive to add to this, and we have other experts on the panel. What interests me is the advances that the theory makes in this book in two respects, and that's on the one hand what I would call its evolutionary perspective. It's generally interested in change, so the change of growth strategies and welfare state reforms rather than welfare state regimes, and of course the macroeconomics, because that is my former life. So the evolutionary perspective, I was quite impressed with it, in particular in the beginning. There is this interest in institutional change of these two regimes is not entirely new. Bob Hanke has written a book on that with respect to France. And over the years, a lot of people have thought about the changes. The famous book in 2005 by Strick and Thelen talked more generally about this, but had also underlying these regimes. New is the interest, at least in some chapters, about endogenous disruptive change that gives then a role to electoral politics. So why did we come out of what Peter Hall in his chapter, I think, is really an extremely accomplished thing. He has written up these things several times now, but each time he brings in a new perspective. And this time it is, for me, the theme of how each phase in the post-World War era, so modernization, he calls it in, the golden age, in neoliberalism and so on, has also the seeds of its own destruction or disruption. So just think about the early post-war years that were, in a way, in terms of growth, really successful. Rising living standards then also lead to the fact that women don't want to remain the reserve army of the labor market, but want to combine career and care, a family and a job. And that is then a disruptive change because some countries are better dealing with that than others, especially those who are focused on manufacturing had a bit of trouble with that, let's say. And then that you actually also look beyond the usual, I always hear this thing, so the conservative welfare state or this coordinated market income, for example, Germany. And it's always Germany. While we are now looking at national cases without a coherent growth regime, that is Italy in Baccaro and the Pontusson chapter. And then Georg Picot looks at 28 OECD countries and to what extent they actually also don't quite fall in line, and where there is inside these different growth regime clusters also quite a bit of variation. And this is quite consequential. Let me illustrate this with a simple analytical model that most of us know, the trilemma of the service economy by Iverson Rennie, more than 20 years ago, where they have in the background is, as you transition to the service economy, you have this Baumol's cost disease, like lower productivity rise in services. And that leads to a trilemma. You cannot have all three at the same time. You can always combine just two. And here you have these models. If you read this in the traditional way, as you find it also in the last chapter of Lias, Hassel and Palier, it is still how do they use welfare state reforms to keep these models pure and simple. They have 5 models, but it's that kind of analytical framework. What I find more interesting is to say, can you really sustain in a social democratic model that you forever ignore fiscal discipline? Sweden felt in the 1980s it couldn't. So did the Christian democratic model think it cannot forever forego employment growth, and came to Hartz reforms in Germany, and others may have other responses to it, in a way that you say, for example, with Peter Hall, you become always susceptible and vulnerable to the critique of the opposition in a well-functioning democracy, that you are performing so weakly on this excluded corner. And that may force your hands, especially if a little crisis is around the corner, as there have been quite a few. What this then would lead you to say, okay, we are not claiming anymore that they are statically these regimes. We are more interested in, if you start from one, are there then varieties of liberalization, as Kathy Thelen called it, or social innovation, as Kathy Jo Martin does, or transition to the service economy, as Anne Wren does in the book. So to look at whether we find the regime classification as actually path dependence. Bruno, I felt there was a lot of talk about path dependence in this, and I would not quite understand how one can do without it in an institutional framework, institutionalist framework. Now to the macroeconomic framework for growth regimes. And there are obviously important questions. When Baccaro and Pontusson started their research program, I was all in favor because I never liked very much the supply side economics. To me, this is an important question, but I understand that you don't want to get into this age-old debate, although I think you cannot completely evade it. I may come to that later in my short presentation. This is the second to last slide. So what are the questions they ask? There is one, do supply-side institutions, wage bargaining systems and so on, privilege certain growth drivers on the demand side? So a coordinated wage bargaining system leads to more export-led growth. I have always a bit the problem with that the answers tend to be post hoc, because if you have highly coordinated wage bargaining, why should in a situation of full employment that not work against maintaining low wages? It can also lead to upwards pressure. And this is what Germany, for example, experienced in the post-unification boom, and took 10 years to get out of it. It fell back into it, but do countries fit their predicted growth regime over time is another question. And I do notice that the small N study of Baccaro-Pontusson differs in its answer from the larger N study by Picot, and that is several times, I feel, the case, which is a contradiction that perhaps one could deal with in the next paper, in the next book. Do countries adapt to crisis in line with these predicted growth models? There are cases in which countries have been thrown off course. Again, that is something that I took from these varieties of change. And even in Baccaro-Pontusson themselves, they think that Sweden, for example, is now in a quite inequalizing, still financialized growth regime that they had thought would be upset by, would not happen after a financial crisis. And then finally, I think here is, what is the role of government policy in all this, both when countries fit and when they don't? I was a bit disappointed that the welfare state plays hardly any role in the early chapters. In this, it later gets better, and that may just be the difference of, scholarly expertise and interest, but that is not fully integrated. And I would think the country case studies later may do more of it. All of these questions are relevant. There's no question about it. And I also understand why you started with these relatively close to the original research program questions, but they could be a bit more ambitious. And I just want to give you in the last slide a few ideas for this. What I would call a macro political economy of growth regimes. So back to basics. Why is growth problematic at all? And here, I'm afraid, Bruno, you have to talk about supply and demand. Of course, it is a truism that for economics, you need supply and demand. But it is exactly the point that Keynes made, that there is no tendency in a capitalist monetary economy where people can store value and wait. There's no guarantee for the capitalist entrepreneur that demand that they have created through employment comes back to it in terms of demand for its goods and services. So do you have a demand side theory is necessary if you say growth doesn't just happen and we are a bit short of it. That's what we feel in the advanced capitalist economies. Now, you can have an answer that goes out of economics and says, well, it's a problem for incoherent regimes. That was an answer that Hall and Gingrich gave, I think, in 2012. You sound as if you say any regime in equilibrium is actually a bit static and needs a new growth driver. It's something that creates a productive imbalance. If you're an unreconstructed Keynesian like I am, then it's a problem for all capitalist economies for the reasons I just outlined. And you could then think of the welfare state as macro stabilizer, that it has been since the New Deal, that then creates favorable conditions for growth. It cannot stimulate growth in and of itself. Another back to basic question. Why was it that the wrong policy paradigm, because a lot of when you read these chapters, you find actually there is we have somehow just gone down the wrong path. We were in the Trente Glorieuses, and then somehow something happened, and suddenly we adopted a policy paradigm, the new Keynesian Nairo model, led to fatally undermining policy decisions like capital liberalization and independent central banks, and then we followed that path ever since. And the EU does it, of course, all on a grand scale, that wrong thing. Before you can now say, okay, this has all been big performative, we all believe in the wrong thing, but where did it originally come from? And I think this is, for you then, a role to say, instead of forever blaming the EU, which is a bit of a tendency in at least 2 chapters, look at emerging conflicts of economic interest and or shifting political power distribution in a situation, for example, of full employment, end of extensive growth, that just shifts these two equilibria, and then the conflicts come out and the power shifts to the employers. This is something one can read a little bit in Cathy Jo Martin or Kathleen Thelen, and I think that should be taken forward instead of forever having this normative stance, oh, the world shouldn't be like that, but unfortunately it is. Finally, growth regimes, the welfare state regimes, they're always treated in and of themselves, and whether countries fall into it or not. Why not for once look at whether they are really inherently in conflict with each other? We have this supposedly because the North is supply side. It can be understood with supply side economics. They control their wage costs, even though I find it's totally implausible for advanced economies with intra-industry trade and big brand names that wage costs would play that much of a role, but this is your thing. And then against that, we have this vulgar pump priming Keynesianism of the consumption-led South. So for the euro area, we have this a little bit where they discuss the interdependence of these models when, you know, frankly, as an economist here, I think for the world economy as a whole, export-led and demand consumption-led is a zero-sum constraint. So at some point, somewhere, the exports must all become an import surplus, so as a net import. So there must be also some complementarity in some simple sense, if only for trade. And the complementarity of rising debt on the side of the deficit countries and of rising claims on the net export countries, there is a complementarity, or either in a big next crisis, they both go down together. And this is, in my view, for example, what the EU or the euro area has tried to achieve, to make this complementarity happen. And this is in the interest of the net exporters as much as of the net importers. And perhaps one should understand it in that way. These would be interesting questions for me to take this further, and not talking you out of your research program, but to say there is a lot that one can take out that is beyond, a bit perhaps less conservative than some of the chapters are at the moment.
Thank you very much, Waltraud, for this very rich series of comments. A lot of food for thought, but we will not try to address them all now. We may come back to some later on because we want to listen to the other panelists. And it's now turn to Alexander Kentikelenis from Bocconi.
Great, thank you very much. And I gather you can see my slides as well?
Yes, we can.
So it's been a real pleasure to read the volume by Bruno and Anke, and I certainly learned a lot. So the many authors of the volume have really broad ambitions, and these ambitions come together very nicely. And of course, some of my comments will apply more to some chapters than others. But more generally, this attempt of the book at making a contribution that unites as well as extends the insights of literatures on varieties of capitalism, regulation studies, and welfare state scholarship, I think has really paid off. So I really have no doubt that the volume will be read and assigned in classes for many years to come. So the main argument of the book is that we should orient our analysis towards understanding the political economy of advanced capitalism through the lens of growth regimes. So Bruno and Anke covered this ground in their presentation, and I really believe in the potential of this research agenda. But rather than enumerate all of the positive things about the volume, I will jump straight into what I think are some blind spots, and I will make 6 comments that are all very macro level comments. So my initial point concerns terminology. So the term growth regimes kind of implies that these regimes actually deliver growth, when this has mostly been anemic growth for the past decade compared to previous periods. So this surely has been positive growth on average, but it is also hardly a level of growth performance that anyone would look to for inspiration on how to grow. So at the moment that secular stagnation is becoming a master narrative in macroeconomics, it is somewhat surprising that the terminology chosen has this inbuilt focus on growth. And whether these growth regimes have actually delivered welfare is an altogether different story. Social policies have been cut drastically among most of the countries covered here, and social welfare has been impacted by the wide and growing inequalities, as even IMF research now documents. But leaving these terminological considerations aside, I would like to offer some comments on how expanding our conceptualization of growth regimes can further strengthen a political economy analysis of advanced capitalism. And I would do this starting off with some observations vis-a-vis domestic level policymakers. and then scaling up to national, regional, and global factors impacting how we understand growth and welfare in rich countries. And all of my slides are purely pictures, so it's only my voiceover that delivers the remarks. So my first point is a quasi-methodological and quasi-theoretical point. So how do we understand the intentionality of policymakers engaged in these processes? Are they really purposeful actors who can shape and reshape the direction of their country's economies? Or are they understood as mere managers of complex bureaucratic machineries where change is only ever available at the margins? And if that is the case, then how do they do it, and how do they keep the necessary political coalitions? So the macroscopic nature of the volume sometimes leaves out a microscopic analysis of who did what and why. So what I'm trying to say here is that there's a lot of contingency in these processes, as the book accepts. There are diverse electoral systems, institutional arrangements, veto points, macroeconomic fundamentals, judicial cases, and so on get in the way and can frustrate attempts at change of even the most determined policymakers. Yet this contingency is somewhat muted in many of the analyses presented in the volume. And at times, I felt that the volume contains almost an ex post piecing together of a coherent and very elegant story based on observed changes, rather than starting off with an analysis of desired changes by policymakers and a comparison with how far they got and an explanation of why that was the case. So in short, deeper historicization could go a long way, not in unnecessarily complexifying the account, but in yielding a richer political economy that keeps an eye on big structural forces while also explaining the positions of actors. My second point scales up from policymakers to state capacity altogether. And the concept of state capacity does not really benefit from systematic discussion in the book. Is a country's existing growth model destiny, unless destabilized by exogenous factors like economic crisis? Or are some states more capable of steering the economy than others, and why? In places where state capacity to shape a growth regime is weak, then what kind of growth regime does emerge and who shapes it? Or to put this more provocatively in the context of the European Union, is it possible that membership has actually strengthened the state capacity of already strong states and weakened the capacity of weaker states? The book indirectly grapples with this question when it explains, and I quote, that the notion of a growth regime assumes less an ex ante strategic planning capacity than the progressive and post hoc discovery of emergent strategies or patterns of action. But this definition suggests a riding the waves approach to politics. And as shown by scholarship and comparative international development, this is not necessarily the best way to generate sustained growth. Explicit planning capacity matters, and even high-income countries have extensive, if hidden, developmental state infrastructures, as the work of Fred Block and Mariana Mazzucato shows us. So of course, Europe is complicated by restrictive aid rules and various other policies, but this brings back the question of state capacity as a dynamic concept. Not only were unequal stocks of such capacity available in different EU countries, but the particular mode of European integration pursued might have entrenched and widened state capacity differences. So my third point has to do with the question of interdependence, which receives a couple of fleeting mentions in the book, but is not really in the center of analysis, which is focused on analyzing individual country trajectories and less on how the trajectories of some countries influence those of others. This would mean placing core and periphery dynamics at the epicenter of analyzing growth regimes. And to phrase this differently, I wonder whether in the European context, especially that of the Eurozone, the appropriate level of analysis is the country level and not the regional level or even the global level. Foregrounding international dynamics would mean placing national level political economies in the context of ever-growing economic integration. And this would bring into focus a range of important issues that are currently a bit obscured by the national level framing. Where is the role of multinational corporations and global finance? How are countries incorporated into global value chains? And ultimately, what policy space do they have to choose different growth trajectories? The analysis of growth regimes as depending on input from voters and producer groups is thus possibly a little bit constricting. Both voters and producer groups operate within a globalized environment marked by high degrees of capital mobility, which can exact severe punishment in case of financial panics and economic crashes. And of course, these global forces, especially global finance, exist in a dialectical relationship with national level policy choices and preferences, but they are analytically distinct from often nationally bounded producer groups, so merit some more systematic treatment. In other words, what I'm trying to say is that some fusion of international political economy with comparative political economy can maybe help the research agenda set out by Bruno and Anke go even further in unpacking the dynamics of advanced capitalism. And I have two final points or questions that are more forward-looking. The first is tinted by me hailing from a peripheral European country that went through the most radical austerity measures ever imposed. So what does the growth regime framing tell us about pathways out of the periphery? My reading of the volume suggests that there are slim chances of peripheral countries to successfully find such pathways, not only because of their own internal processes or limitations, but also because of the way they are incorporated into the European economic project. This is very aptly captured by the concept of competitive impoverishment that the concluding chapter of the volume introduces. As the authors explain, and I quote, Southern European countries are expected to become cheap enough to become competitive, i.e. to sell cheap products abroad, to attract foreigners with tourism and attract FDI to develop some industrial activities. This is accurate as a stylized description of reality, but surely not seen as a desirable place to be in for the countries themselves. And you see kind of an example of Dutch views on lazy Southern Europeans and the press that Southern European countries get, basically tourism-dependent economies. And indeed, the collapse of tourism in the post-COVID era or in the COVID era shows how Southern European pre-existing vulnerabilities are accentuated by the excessive reliance on this industry, which is also one that is orthogonal to environmental protection, thereby potentially spelling further trouble down the line. So these countries have ended up in this competitive impoverishment dynamic. And this is not by explicit political choice, although the cumulative effect of bad political decision matters, but as a logical consequence of EU-level politics and priorities. And in this context, the feedback loop from voters to growth regimes is tenuous at best, if at all existent. So to restate the question, is there a way out of this trap for peripheral economies? Or does the future only hold the continuing management of economic decline? And the second and final question is an invitation to the authors to reflect on the impact of COVID and its aftermath on the main arguments of the book. So over the past year, all rule books have been torn, and across rich countries, states have actively intervened to shelter people and businesses from COVID-related disruptions. In parallel, they use policies vis-a-vis state aid, deficits, and so on, are on hold for the foreseeable future. Indeed, there is a lot of policy debate around economic nationalism, building up long foregone manufacturing capacities, and further supporting strategic industries. So to quote from The Wizard of Oz, I have a feeling we're not in Kansas anymore. And maybe returning to Kansas is not that desirable anyway. So how do the main messages of the book relate to the shifting political economic ground that we are witnessing? Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Alexander, for your comments and questions and insights. And I think we see some overlaps with Walter's comments with other ones, but we'll continue to gather comments by listening to Anton.
Okay, I'm gonna share my screen. Do you see it?
Yes, but we see it by the end, and
okay. Let's go to the beginning.
You want to start from the beginning and then put a full screen. And I see that you have a slide I have already shown.
Yeah. I'll
go ahead.
skip that. Thank you, Anke. Thank you, Bruno, for inviting me to discuss your wonderful volume. And what I really like about this book is that you make us think. I mean, there's so many books that tell us how we should think about advanced capitalism, about the electoral turn and how we should do our research. I mean, your book allows you or pressures us to really think about a number of very important questions. And of course, because of that, there are also some internal contradictions between chapters. But I think that's an asset rather than a disadvantage. So I really want to congratulate you on that. And I think one of the important contributions is that you kind of re-engage the old political economy literature of thinking about growth and the welfare state away from a narrow focus on partisan politics, and also away from how producer groups coordinate the economy among themselves. And in that respect, and this is also because of the important contribution of Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontus, is you really bring the state back in. And I think in your last slide, you make that element very important. Now on Baccaro and Pontussen, I have a sort of a side comment that I'd like to flag here, because it's true, they bring macroeconomics back in. And at the center of their analysis is the wage bargain. And in hindsight, I'm not so sure if the wage bargain today is at the center of what we do, and is particularly at the center of what welfare states do. I think the wage bargain is at the origin of the post-war welfare state, but in a way, the welfare state, education, pension systems have kind of taken over the centrality of the wage bargain. Not that wage bargaining is unimportant, it happens in the public sector, in the private sector, but I think it's the growth of the state itself that should really be the focus of our attention. And in a way, they talk about a growth model that is relatively balanced, which is the Scandinavian growth model. Maybe it does apply to the Netherlands as well. I'm not so sure. And then most of the other models are unbalanced. And I was thinking about this balance. What is it exactly? And Waltraud brought in the trilemma, and I think that's very helpful in a way. Because, behind the trilemma, and I think this is also a mistake that Gösta Esping-Andersen made in his 1990 book, in the conclusion, behind the trilemma is the Bhumil-Cost disease, is the idea that, services cannot be productive. And therefore, the state, which is basically only services, cannot be productive, or doesn't have a productive function in the overall economy. Now, that becomes rather problematic when the state, channels about 30% of GDP to the economy. If that is not productive in any kind of way, I think, as a growth model, you probably have a problem. But in a way, Esping-Andersen was wrong, because, his reasoning was the Scandinavian countries run into a tax problem. The Germanic countries run into an employment problem, and the liberal market economies run into an inequality problem when it comes to the welfare state. And in a way, lo and behold, looking back on this, the Scandinavian countries never really got into a tax problem because their education system, their health systems gave a sort of productivity knock-on effect on the larger economy. So the entry productivity levels of graduates from high schools and university was somewhat higher than in the other economies. And I think something happened to Germany recently in which there's an understanding that for the German economy, before, the state should be very, very small because of, you know, the burden of the Boma cost disease. And if you would kick women onto the labor market and they had to be paid by, you know, decent wages, that would sort of, you know, be a burden on growth. But in a way, what happened in Germany after wage moderation, and particularly with respect to family policy, you see a massive expansion of female employment that's add to the macroeconomy, that you know, if guys moderate their wages and women enter the labor market and contribute to the family wage, even though it could only be part-time, then that macroeconomic knock-on effect is very, very large. This goes beyond the sort of domestic stabilization function of the welfare state that Waltraud talked about. So I think this element is something that we need to really, really look into more carefully in the future. Now, Bruno, I do this quickly, already showed this graph, and this is basically to show that the more service-intensive welfare states actually do quite well in relative terms when it comes to two things: employment and inequality. And this is consistent with another very interesting something that we know, that in the 1990s, it was Sweden and the US that had the highest level of labor force participation in the OECD world. And here you see in the middle how the US, even with very aggressive fiscal policy in the wake of the Great Recession, is kind of falling behind many of the northern economies, which still have quite generous welfare states. So there must be something to the welfare state that can contribute to employment, can contribute to growth. And then the question is, what is it? And here you see one element that is very, very important, that's a bit under neglected, in the volume, is the importance of female participation in the labor market, and also gender policies, you know, leave policies, early childhood policies, et cetera, and it's, you know, by and large, it's family spending that correlates with low levels of child poverty. So what is this coherence that in a way you kind of say, well, there are just a few countries that do social investment, the rest does dualization or asset welfare? I'm not so sure. I think this diffusion of the social investment perspective is much wider, and it's slow, but you know, it takes time than you admit. And it's a combination of things that are fundamental to social investment welfare state. They have relatively inclusive buffers, so social assistance plus social insurance, because, you know, we are going through more volatile labor market. That's true of Italy as much as Spain and Sweden and Denmark. It's really about easing the flow of more heterogeneous work-life family transitions. I mean, this is something that the Germans started relatively late after the Dutch, and where the Scandinavians were there far before. But you know, elements before the Great Recession were already there to be seen also in a country like Spain. And then something that is relatively expensive is this notion of, you know, you need a long-term commitment to human capital stock development in a knowledge economy. And you also need it because you want to pay for your pension. So sometimes I think of the welfare state a la Wolfgang Streeck as a bit of a productive constraint. And to the extent that most European countries, they sit on a big pot of commitments to the welfare state that is very difficult to retrench. And that pushes them to kind of rethink, how can I use this commitment in a productive way to keep benefits at a decent level for pensions, but also in order to be able to pay for pensions in the long run. And then obviously it's important that you have high levels of employment, and that these levels of employment have to be productive, enter early childhood education and human capital stock over the life course. And I think if you look back on the Great Recession and at the numbers that I just showed you, this kind of message becomes exposed by these developments. And now we have the COVID-19 stress test. And all of a sudden, in just a couple of weeks ago in the economies, there is this massive affirmation of, thank God we have a welfare state. Because, for the past 30 years, we've been thinking about the welfare state as a burden on economic growth, even in the political science literature that's relatively agnostic to this. So you see a massive boost to welfare provision over the past year in terms of healthcare, furlough schemes, and thanks to digitalization, we didn't go into the abyss. There's a normative comeback of this veil of ignorance sentiment that it's actually pretty important to have a good insurance, to have resilience in your economy through the welfare states. There's a massive shift towards deeper fiscal solidarity. And this is, you can say this is the growing pains of a more political union. Again, it takes time. And this is largely in sync with public opinion research that I do at EOI, where wider European publics, they say we want to live in welfare democracies and a more protective and at the same time more global EU. And this may be a precursor to develop something of the EMU as an insurance union for active welfare states. So these are my reflections on your great book. I mean, I have a final remark which relates to this interaction between the domestic and the European. I mean, I'm not so sure. I mean, in the tradition of welfare state studies and varieties of capitalism, we always need to somehow reify models and pathways and path dependencies. And, we've been living through an era of such massive change, and we will be confronted with even more change in the future. I'm not so sure that, that this kind of hook that we have on sort of trying to stabilize our own sort of research by reifying growth models or welfare regimes, whether that's really the way forward. I think we should loosen up a little for that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thank you very much, Anton, for your comments. We have one more commentator, and that is Bela.
Let me stop share.
Sorry. Just a second, okay?
That's okay.
In the meantime, we thank Waltraud for having answered to one question about the veil of endurance. Thank you very much.
Okay.
It was working when we got prepared, but it will work.
Yeah,
again.
it should work soon. Just a second, okay? Yeah. Okay, so I will do 3 things in this brief commentary. One is that I will join those who welcome this newborn baby to the ever-growing family of comparative capitalist models. And I tell a few words why I find it a likable baby. The second is that I will be a little bit critical, point out that maybe it could have more hair, or maybe the 2 legs are not of equal length. Basically talking a little bit about methodological and conceptual identity issues, which refer to the whole book, but mostly my comments are based on the first and the second and the last chapter, the framing chapters. And then the rest of my remarks are basically focusing on how the volume deals with the periphery, and in particular the eastern periphery, Europe's eastern periphery. So let me start. So actually, is reminiscent for me a classic volume, Peter Gurevich's Poets in Hard Times, both in its strength and in its weakness. So I love that book, which means that I also consider this a great book. I look forward teaching this book in my political economy classes. Oh, it has a basically comparative political economy research question, tries to explain diverse national responses to common challenges. I will later tell a few words about these challenges and how they are common. It is also an umbrella concept, a synthesis that tries to bridge and partly manages varieties of capitalism frameworks, growth model frameworks, the Kaleckian neo-Keynesian frameworks, and varieties of words of welfare. And here, the synthesis is basically resting on 2 ideas, which I found very original and actually interesting. One is that the same institutions are viewed and shown to be consequential for both the supply side and the demand side of growth. This is witty. The second is that welfare reforms are seen as part and parcel of growth regimes, and the volume points in sophisticated ways on the political and socioeconomic institutional linkages between growth regimes and welfare regimes. And then there are 3 more aspects which I found good. One is a bit funny. So while half of the comparative politics world is upset about financialization as being behind the populist counterattack against liberalism, both in its political and economic manifestations, the book somehow rehabilitates financialization and says, oh, it's a good thing. It creates demand, but also investment for investment into the knowledge-based economy and investment into privatized welfare. The second issue, which I find interesting and important, that it opens up to gender. Now, since many of the previous varieties of capitalist models they're a little bit stuck to the great 30 years and then what came after, and their heroes are manufacturing white male workers. This opening in the book and also in partly derivative literature. For instance, the work of one of the authors, Sonia Avlias, I like to read about it, is a novelty. And then it even opens towards the periphery. It normalizes the periphery. By normalization, I mean that so far, most of the available comparative capitalism frameworks considered the periphery either as mixed model, is a dictio in adjecto, or cocktail capitalism as far as East Europe is concerned, or patchwork capitalism. Now somehow there is a normalization in this volume, meaning that the periphery can have growth and welfare state identities. Now let me turn now to how I see the analytic identity of the book. Here I will be very briefly. The book basically embraces complexity of reality, but at the price of some sacrifices in terms of rigor and parsimony. Now, of course, I am a follower of Albert Hirschman, who in my view is almost right in everything. And he told about this kind of methodological choices that he would rather be eclectic than reductionist. And anyway, it's very difficult to tell where the golden mean between these two alleged vices lie. Now, the book is also methodologically nationalist. We heard about it already in the presentation comments of Alexander. Then there is a degree of economic reductionism because the main explanation of welfare state reforms here is economic growth regime features, and there is a feedback loop. Now, of course, one may ask, okay, is it really sure that welfare state reflect only economic impacts and influences and purposes of growth? Isn't it that welfare state actually can be related to nation state building, excluding minorities, including natives, and a number of other issues? So here I find a little bit narrow the perspective. And then the last thing is that the framework focuses on politics as usual, meaning it explains how governments can generate political support in democracies as usual by offering growth and jobs. Now, this is fine for most of the times, but if one asks nowadays people on the street, what are the major challenges capitalism faces? They would tell you refugee flows, COVID, climate change. So these are, of course, challenges that are common to capitalism to core, not only its varieties. And they indicate anything else than the sufficiency of a politics as usual perspective. So probably we should work a little bit more about our memories of politics of radical change. And this takes me further. So there is a window opened here to the Eastern periphery. The problem is, I felt, whereas I celebrate this opening, that it is a little bit minimalist. So the book has 6 to 7 chapters, case studying Germany, Sweden, and the UK. And of course, these are extremely important countries, as they are the major actors in virtually all the comparative political economy volumes that I have read, including actually the Gurevich book. But then when compared, I really did not envy the authors of the last chapter, in which 7 East European countries also get 5 pages. So it's very difficult. Imagine to summarize Germany, Sweden, and and the UK in 5 pages in a book of 450 pages, right? So it's a challenging task. Now, obviously, if you have so little space to present evidence on these countries, then yes, theorizing might be broad, it might be witty, but it will be necessarily sketchy. I am not saying theorizing on an empirical wasteland, just sketchy, focusing on the main features. And then what I read as a theorizing of East Central Europe, the Visegrad states and the Baltic states in particular, that they somehow, in their types of the growth strategy, welfare state nexus, tend to replicate core models. So just to summarize, which is obvious just for those who haven't read the book, so there are 2 dependent pathways presented: Germany's periphery, the 4 Visegrad countries, Hungary, Poland, Slovakia, and Czechia, which basically underwent a foreign direct investment-led manufacturing reindustrialization growth regimes, which is combined with a Bismarckian type of welfare system, offering work-related compensation to losers and cash benefits. Whereas the Baltic states, Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, that appear in the book as sort of a Scandinavian periphery, in the sense that they combine service export, high quality service export, with an ICT and knowledge-oriented growth regime, and pursue social investment-oriented welfare state. As to the Baltic state, I would wish to see it. And I got very much provoked and interested in this kind of interpretation. So far, I have seen the Baltic states as classic examples of an anthropo-growth model, which basically does 2 services for its hinterland, basically dealing with Soviet and now Russian export and import of resources and machinery and equipment, and doing money laundering for the Danske Bank and Swedbank, 2 important cases that we just heard about. So, but let's also, before I show some data, which will be the last slide of mine, admit that if these countries indeed do the kind of replica developmental strategies is claimed, where I would not debate the Visegrad story, that's in my view pretty properly done. They are between a rock and a hard place. What is the rock? That they try to achieve manufacturing upgrading and maintain a measure of welfare amidst the condition of free movement of capital and what Sharp in the volume calls competitive impoverishment. How far is this sustainable? And pursue social investment amidst free movement of labor and the possibility of brain drain. Now, the important question here is, if these countries pursue social investment indeed, is this not actually social investment into the welfare states of core countries? Through brain drain, through labor market migration, through movement of labor. I find here a problematic important to discuss, especially that I heard, for instance, trade unions, Hungarian trade unions, discussing the possibility with their Western counterparts that Western core states should invest into the training in Hungary, Poland, the Czech Republic of doctors, teachers, nurses, social workers that are intensively used in the social investment care chains and healthcare systems of Western Europe. So now the question is, does the ICT and knowledge-oriented growth model growth regime and social investment welfare state exist in the periphery at all? If so, is it to be found in the Baltics? And what is its political story? And here I come to my last slide, where I show you data. I took a look, a cursory look at Eurostat data and also a currently running research project on social investment welfare states. Now, I have two numbers, comparative numbers about the size of or characterizing the growth regime, the size of the ICT sector in GDP, and the percentage of employment in high-tech sectors and knowledge-intensive services, and two on social investments, public spending on the social investment areas of the European social policy network, and public spending on family, education, and labor market. I chose Sweden as the one of the social investment welfare states as a definition, then Hungary, a representative of the Visegrad states, and Estonia as the best of the Balts. Now, what we see here is something funny and messy. So Sweden, as you would expect, is first on all these dimensions, both the the growth regime and the welfare state dimension. You would expect, based on your book, Estonia to be. Now, it's not the case. Interestingly, on the one hand, Estonia is pretty far from Sweden for having a high quality service and intensive growth model, an ICT intensive growth model, as well as social investment welfare state. But of course, you can't say, yeah, it's a replica, it's a para-replica. It's nice that it can do it all. But then comes Hungary in a puzzling way, actually squeezed into Sweden and Estonia. So Hungary then does have or does not have a social investment welfare state. What we know about Hungary, that for Hungary, social investment is only its second specialization of its welfare state. The first one is the Bismarckian, but Estonia has almost nothing in terms of a Bismarckian welfare state. So can we then on this ground tell, okay, if it has only a social investment welfare state, even if less generous than, let's say, the Hungarian, calling Estonia and the Baltic states specializing in social investment welfare state and high-tech experiented sectors of the economy. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Bela, and thank you all for terrific comments and very rich comments. We don't have much time left, and what I would like to do is to give people the floor who want to ask a question and who want to come into this discussion before we respond to some of the comments, and also before we give the floor then again to our panelists who also might want to respond to each other or comment on to each other. So if there's anyone who wants to come in, please raise your hand. And I can't see the hands. Bruno, can you see the hands?
Yeah, we have a question in the chat.
Okay.
So I tried to answer some Q&R on the way when they were raised, but now we have, how does innovation as a long-term driver of growth come in your approach? For instance, would you see growth model as associated with different areas of innovation? And there is then compliments that we thank you, Thomas Pastor, for. Anke, do you want to start? We can address some of the points made by our discussants. Do you want to?
Yes, I can start. I found all these comments very thoughtful and all of them very challenging. And obviously with some of them, we sort of thought about them before and we You know, we had similar questions in mind, and then sort of we proceeded how we did. I think our core contribution to the entire comparative political economy debate is really to think beyond where we were when we left the varieties of capitalism approach, and that is, you know, and which enriched our discussion so much, and which also dominated a lot of the literature for such a long time after it was published 20 years ago. And it came to a standstill, I think, about 10 years ago, when people sort of became more critical of different types, different regimes, different approaches, and they said it's too static, and we don't really want to look at the world through the perspective of two different types of capitalism. And that is really, you know, where we wanted to move beyond it, but we did not want to drop it, because we do believe that thinking in terms of ideal types of economic development, but also of the interaction between the welfare state and the economy, makes a lot of sense and explains a lot of development. So our unit of analysis is the nation state, and that is obviously, you know, something one can criticize, that we use the nation state and the institutions of the political economy of a nation state is our starting point. And I think there is some theoretical reason for that, because we do believe that in advanced industrialized economies, the way they have developed over the last 100 years was really based on an institutional core, and the institutional core did develop during the phase of industrialization, where you got certain regulations, certain institutions, where you had the strong focus on the wage bargain, and around the focus on the wage bargain, you had the development of the welfare state. And a lot of these institutions which provide social protection today are institutions that were actually conceived and developed 100 or 150 years ago. So there is a deep institutional core, but also a deep bargain between different actors and different classes at the time that make up not only the welfare state as we know it and have known it for a very long time, but also which have sort of shaped the economic development of these countries for a very long time. And we think, you know, this is at the core of our understanding of the political economy of these countries. So I think the sort of methodological criticism, you know, why do you look at countries? Why don't you put them more in a perspective of economic integration? How can you do that in a globalized world? I think the decisions that are taken and these policy decisions we are ultimately interested in come from a understanding which are within the country, and are focused on actors who shape these policy decisions. So I think this is where we're coming from, but we wanted to move beyond just a sort of dichotomy that we there have liberal market economies and we have coordinated market economies, and we know sort of how they operate, et cetera, et cetera. And we welcome and embrace very much the discussion which was then started by Lucio Baccaro and Jonas Pontusson when they started talking about growth models, and when they said we need to bring in the demand side of the equation. But in order not to lose the national institutions and our understanding of national institutions, our concern was really not to lose the supply side as well. And I think the focus on the supply side, or at least the integration of the supply side in our conceptual thinking, has to do with the role of innovation. And there was a question on the role of innovation. There was also the question on sort of how can we understand financialization, but also what about the digital economy? I think we need the supply side understanding of how the business community is changing over time, and the role of the business community, and how the business community is embracing digital tools in order to understand how these economies are restructuring, and what the role of social policy is in this process of restructuring. So if we could, and I fully admit that we sort of don't spell this out in our chapters in the book, because we sort of were pleased that we got to where we got to, you know, that we pulled it off the way it was. But really, if we were to sort of expand this, I think what we need to expand is really what are the preconditions for productivity enhancing restructurings of firms in the context of national political economies. So how does the interaction between either investments into skills, but also investments into workplaces, also investment into health and safety, also investment into family policies, the integration of women at the workplace. How does this lead to different kinds of firms, and how does this lead to different kind of work in these economies? I think that is the perspective we want to pursue, and that is why we sort of keep the supply side in, because this is happening, in companies, and that is, the conditions under which companies operate. So this is the defense of sort of for the methodological nationalism, that we use the nation and the institutions of the nation state as a starting point. And that is also why we kept in the sort of supply side focus. That is why we sort of ignored some, obvious sort of important developments when it comes to globalization, interdependence of different countries. We pay, indirectly, we obviously acknowledge the interdependence of countries by talking about export-led growth and demand-led growth, because, obviously they are interrelated, these two. You can only have an export-led model if someone imports and has a sort of negative trade balance. So, there's an implicit understanding of this, but we do not make it explicit. I think what Anton said was really important, and it got me really thinking about the wage bargain. How can we, how important is the wage bargain today? And I think you're absolutely right. It was, a key concept in the process of industrialization, and it drove a lot of these institutional developments, which we think are so important. But how important is it today? And sort of you raised some doubt about it. I think what we see is actually it is changing a lot, and it has become a much more loosely defined model. And even in those countries where we have very strong wage setting institutions, we see a lot of inequalities, and these inequalities are intra-firm inequalities, they're inter-firm inequalities, they are different kinds of inequalities than they were before. And it's not, and this also changes the nature of the workplace, and it changes the nature of companies and how they operate it. And again, I think we need to pay more attention to that, and we need to sort of move on our research agenda to really understand these processes. And that is something I will try to do in, when moving this book along, and sort of trying to think about what's happening next. In terms of our sort of second volume, when we will present some of the country cases, we try to go into more historical depth, and that was something that Alexander said, that we should really focus or go deeper in our understanding what's happening at the micro level, what is happening at the level of policy decisions. And at least sort of Bruno and I, we are sort of experts in our own countries. We understand our own countries pretty well and have done a lot of research on our own countries. And we know how that there are critical junctures. And, both in France, but definitely in Germany, we had a sort of number of critical junctures when, about 20 years ago, when Germany started to embrace financialization, and it really did not work. The German government was very serious about, pursuing a much more focused approach on financialization, and could not make it happen. And there was a whole number of sort of political reasons why it could not make it happen, but it was also related to a dominant coalition of actors which were based in the manufacturing industries, who allied with insurance companies, etc. So there is a political dynamic, and you can prove that these decisions are shaped by dominant actors in the existing growth regimes, and that obviously leads to path dependencies, and leads to the fact that it is not easy to change a path. And I think Kathy Thielen shows quite sort of convincingly that in some countries, if you do get a different actor constellations, you can also shift the path. But in some countries, if you're sort of very wedded to a particular growth regime, it is actually very difficult to do so. And this doesn't make any judgment on whether that is the better path or not. You know, I wouldn't want to make any sort of judgment whether it was the right decision to pursue financialization or what it would have been the wrong decision if they had succeeded in doing so. So this is from my side. I don't know, Bruno, you should sort of
a few words to thank you all, and perhaps a kind of pirouette, as we say in French, is you are asking us a lot, and this is showing that you read this book as one of the definitive one, but as you know, the book on the evolution of capitalism is an ongoing process of a succession of books. You quoted Greskovits. We could, of course, speak of many others, but we try to bring a new thing on board, and there will be a second volume where, as Waltraud expects, there will be more stuff. As I alluded to in the chat, we will have 3 full chapters on Eastern Europe. Bela, you will be happy, in the WOPSI project, where we confirm with different data from yours that the Baltic countries are going on the social investment way. We'll discuss. We will invite you again to be discussant at this stage. I think I must say that something we miss because of our configuration is the good connection between IP and CP. So I hope that with Alexander, Waltraud, and a few others, we are able to make an extra volume on this, because this is a recurring critique on us. And as Anke said, we keep the national level because we want to look at what government do. We think it's part of the story, but this makes us miss, if not the EU, because we tried hard to keep the EU on board, but to miss this multinational companies and this interaction between the various models. And this, of course, is a chantier. Just one thing, Bela, is that, as you know, I'm a welfare state scholar, and I'm not saying in this book that welfare state is only having economic impact, or only it's an economic story. I'm not saying it's the economy stupid. I'm just saying to my colleagues working on the welfare state, why don't you look a little bit to economic growth strategy, etc., because it is also an economic story. That's the point. And we are, I think, very clear in the introduction is that, of course, it's not the full story about the welfare state, but it does help to understand some path taken by welfare state reforms, which is too often neglected in the welfare state literature. And on the other hand, as you almost all of you mentioned, probably the comparative political economy literature lacks of details and analysis of welfare states in a broad sense to incorporate this type of institution. I could go on and on, but there are we are short of time now, and there are many other things, and there will be other opportunities to discuss the book. But I don't know whether you want to reflect upon each other's comments as a last tour of this excellent and brilliant panel. And then we will have the last goodbye words with Anke. So, Waltraud, do you want to add?
No, anything? I just want to thank you. I mean, you got a lot of things to think about. And I also was surprised how well our comments complemented each other with similar themes with a very different tack. It is, as one of us said, I think, Anton, it makes you think. And what better compliment can one give a book?
And the complementarity of the comments show that CIVICA is well framed in a way. Yes, Alexander, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, well, I would like to thank you as well. It's been wonderful listening to my colleagues. I guess as a just very short comment on what Anke said, I completely understand and endorse this idea that, well, we need to place the policy decisions in context, in the country context, and so on. But I think that especially in the years to come, I mean, following the debates around the Recovery and Resilience Program with approval of reform programs at the European level and the vetoes of some countries on the programs of others, kind of the permeability of the national level has increased even further, even beyond I mean, the Troika countries, but even beyond the European semester processes and so on. So that will be fascinating to explore in the subsequent projects. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Anton. Last word, if you wish.
You're mute, Anton.
Okay, here I am. Thanks for inviting me, and I second what Alexander just said. I mean, there's something you said, Bruno, in your kind of last remark, and I fully agree with that. That the point is, you know, the welfare state has grown tremendously, and you cannot get the GDP back into the bottle. So to think about a welfare state that is sort of like minimalist in, you know, the 21st century, that's not going to happen. But because it captures so much of GDP, we have to think about it, how to make it productive and sustainable. So its origins lie in politics against markets, but once it's there, you cannot deny its contribution or not, or where it should stop when it comes to growth. And I think that's an important point that you guys have made.
And also, when it comes to degrowth and climate change, you know, there was a question in the Q&A, and I answered, alas, we didn't see any. And really, this is an empirical fact. We looked at growth strategies and economic policies, and we didn't see much of preoccupation about slowing down the growth and acclimating to the climate change. It's around just a side remarks, because this is really perhaps us who were blind, but I think really governments who are totally blind in their obsession with growth, with the climate change event. Bela,
Yeah, just thank you very much for the interesting book and the very interesting event. And just one clarification, perhaps, that what I am really missing probably is not more country studies, because I am familiar with these cases pretty well. What I am missing is something more fundamental, namely the understanding that the core doesn't exist without its peripheries. So it's not only the periphery which is dependent, and that capitalism's politics is not merely politics as usual. It is sometimes politics of radical change, of extraordinary politics, of revolutions and collapse. And I think that what I would like to see more in any comparative capitalism consideration and effort is a strong attention to these two things.
Thank you very much. I must say that, of course, you have identified the 5 pages in our last chapter on Eastern Europe. But for instance, what you just said is very clear in Georg Picot's chapter about the, the association, let's say, of the German growth model and the Visegrad countries, for instance. And there are a few other places where your point is made. About disruption and revolution, I think you're absolutely right. And perhaps we overlooked that a little bit in the book. Anke, do you want to say?
I just want to thank everyone for for taking the time, for reading the book, for making great comments, for making us think. I think I go away from this with a lot of thoughts, and and to continue the work on this. Thank you very much, everyone.
So I would join Anke in thanking you all, the panelists, but also Sophia Perez and Andrea and Christopher and Hélène Naudet, who have helped a lot to build this wonderful event. I'd like to thank all the audience who attended this. Of course, you can read the book. It's now available. There will be more events, and we look forward to discussing your books and this whole happy, sometimes conflictual family of comparative political economy, as Bela said. Goodbye, and thank you very much to all. Thank you.
Thanks.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
And as I said, the video.
So it's a pleasure to get to know you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
And as I said in the chat, the video will be put online, and if contributors allow, we will also share the slides, but we'll see with you guys if you want to share. Bye. Goodbye, everybody.
Bruno, do you want to stay on the call for a moment?
Yes, but I just let people leave the room because they are in the room.